Bob Dylan, the voice of a generation.
Hello, my friends. Today, I want to tell you the extraordinary story of Bob Dylan, the man who changed music forever. This is not just a story about a singer or songwriter. It's a journey through rebellion, poetry, revolution, and reinvention. Bob Dylan is one of the most influential artists in history, and his life is like an epic novel filled with mystery, controversy, and genius. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this amazing story, perfect for your English practice, and I promise you will be inspired by every moment of it. Chapter 1: The Boy from Minnesota. Over 80 years ago, on May 24, 1941, a baby boy was born in Duluth, Minnesota. This baby's name was Robert Allen Zimmerman, but the world would come to know him as Bob Dylan. He would grow up to become a voice for millions, a poet laureate of rock and roll, and a man who would never stop changing. But before all of that, he was just a Jewish kid from the Midwest with big dreams and a restless spirit. Robert's family was working class and close-knit. His father, Abraham Zimmerman, managed an appliance store, and his mother, Beatty Stone, was a homemaker. They were Jewish immigrants' children. Robert's grandparents had fled persecution in Eastern Europe to find safety in America. Growing up in Hibbing, a small mining town in northern Minnesota, young Robert felt like an outsider from the very beginning. Hibbing was a quiet place where nothing much happened. The winters were freezing, the summers were short, and most people worked in the iron mines. For a boy with imagination and curiosity like Robert, it felt like a prison. He spent his childhood dreaming of escape, of something bigger, something more exciting than the gray streets and ordinary routines of small-town life. But Robert had a secret passion that would change everything: music. When he was just 10 years old, he heard rock and roll for the first time on the radio. The sound of Little Richard, Elvis Presley, and Hank Williams hit him like lightning. It was wild, rebellious, and alive. Robert knew immediately that music was his way out. He begged his parents for a guitar, and when he finally got one, he practiced for hours every single day. At school, Robert was not the most popular kid. He was shy, bookish, and a little awkward. But when he picked up that guitar, something magical happened. He formed his first band in high school, playing rock and roll covers at local talent shows and school dances. His classmates didn't quite know what to make of him, this strange, intense boy who mumbled when he talked but came alive on stage. What made Robert different was his deep love of poetry and literature. While most teenagers were reading comic books, Robert was devouring the works of Arthur Rimbaud, Dylan Thomas, and Woody Guthrie. Yes, Woody Guthrie, the folk singer who wrote songs about workers, wanderers, and the American dream. Robert became obsessed with Guthrie's music. He loved how Guthrie used simple words to tell powerful stories about real people's struggles. Robert spent hours in his room listening to records, reading poetry, and writing his own songs. He felt like he didn't belong in Hibbing, and he couldn't wait to leave. His parents wanted him to go to college, get a good job, and live a safe, stable life. But Robert had other plans. He dreamed of becoming a musician, a poet, a voice for something bigger than himself. When Robert graduated from high school in 1959, he did what his parents wanted. He enrolled at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. But college life didn't interest him much. He skipped classes, played guitar in coffee houses, and immersed himself in the folk music scene that was starting to grow in the city. It was in Minneapolis that Robert Zimmerman began to transform into Bob Dylan. Why Bob Dylan? He later said he took the name from the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, whose wild, beautiful poetry had moved him deeply. The name sounded mysterious, poetic, and completely different from Robert Zimmerman. It was the first of many reinventions that would define his career. Bob Dylan wasn't just a stage name, it was a new identity, a fresh start, a way to become the person he always wanted to be. In Minneapolis, Dylan discovered the folk music community. Folk music in the early 1960s was more than just entertainment, it was a movement. Folk singers wrote songs about social justice, civil rights, peace, and the struggles of ordinary people. Dylan found his tribe among these artists, poets, and activists. He performed in small clubs, coffee houses, and house parties, playing traditional folk songs and his own original compositions. But Dylan knew that Minneapolis was just a stepping stone. There was a bigger stage calling him, a place where all the great folk singers were gathering, where the revolution was happening. That place was New York City. In January 1961, at just 19 years old, Bob Dylan dropped out of college, packed his guitar, and hitchhiked to New York City with almost no money in his pocket. His parents were devastated. They thought he was throwing his life away. But Dylan knew he had to take this risk. He had to follow his dreams no matter how crazy they seemed. And so, with nothing but talent, determination, and an unshakable belief in himself, Bob Dylan set off to conquer the world. His journey was just beginning. Chapter 2: Arrival in Greenwich Village. When Bob Dylan arrived in New York City in January 1961, he had almost nothing, just a guitar, a harmonica, and a burning desire to make it as a folk singer. He was young, unknown, and broke, but he had something more valuable than money. He had talent, ambition, and a perfect timing. New York's Greenwich Village was the center of the folk music revival, and Dylan was about to become its brightest star. Greenwich Village was unlike anywhere Dylan had ever been. The streets were filled with artists, poets, musicians, and activists. Coffee houses and clubs stayed open late into the night, with performers sharing songs about love, war, peace, and justice. Everyone seemed to be talking about changing the world. For Dylan, it felt like coming home.
Dylan wasted no time. He started performing at small clubs and coffee houses, playing wherever someone would let him. He played at Café Wa, the Gaslight Café, and Gerd's Folk City, tiny venues packed with passionate music lovers. At first, people weren't sure what to make of this scrawny kid with the nasal voice and the harmonica around his neck. But once they heard his songs, they couldn't forget him. Dylan had a unique style. His voice was rough and raw, nothing like the smooth crooners on the radio. But there was something authentic about it, something honest. He sang like someone who had lived a hard life, even though he was barely 20 years old. He sang traditional folk songs, blues standards, and increasingly his own original compositions. His lyrics were poetic, mysterious, and powerful. One of Dylan's first missions in New York was to meet his hero, Woody Guthrie. Guthrie was seriously ill with Huntington's disease and living in a hospital in New Jersey. Dylan visited him regularly, playing songs for him and learning everything he could. Guthrie became Dylan's mentor and inspiration. Dylan even wrote a song called "Song to Woody" as a tribute to his hero. Meeting Guthrie gave Dylan a sense of purpose. He wanted to carry on Guthrie's legacy of writing songs for the people. But Dylan wasn't content to just copy Woody Guthrie. He wanted to create his own voice, his own style, and he was about to get his big break. In September 1961, Dylan performed at Gerd's Folk City in Greenwich Village. In the audience that night was a music critic from the New York Times named Robert Shelton. Shelton was impressed by Dylan's raw talent and wrote a glowing review, calling him a talented young performer with a bright future. That review changed everything. Suddenly, people in the music industry were paying attention to Bob Dylan. Within weeks of that review, Dylan was signed by Columbia Records, one of the biggest record labels in the world. His producer was the legendary John Hammond, who had discovered Billie Holiday and Count Basie. Hammond believed Dylan was special, even though many people at Columbia Records thought signing a folk singer was a risky move. Rock and roll was what sold records, not folk music. But Hammond trusted his instincts. In March 1962, Bob Dylan released his first album, simply titled Bob Dylan. The album was mostly traditional folk songs and blues covers, with only 2 original songs. It didn't sell well at first, only about 5,000 copies in the first year. Some people at Columbia Records called Dylan Hammond's Folly, implying that signing him was a mistake. But Dylan wasn't discouraged. He knew he was just getting started. While his first album was a commercial disappointment, Dylan was already working on something bigger. He was writing his own songs, powerful, original compositions that would change music forever. He spent his days and nights in his small apartment in Greenwich Village, surrounded by books, records, and a typewriter, crafting lyrics that were more like poetry than traditional song lyrics. The early 1960s were a turbulent time in America. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, young people were questioning authority, and tensions were rising over the Cold War and nuclear weapons. Dylan saw all of this, felt all of this, and channeled it into his music. He started writing protest songs, songs about injustice, war, and the struggles of ordinary people. In 1963, Dylan released his second album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, and this time the world took notice. The album included some of the most iconic protest songs ever written: Blowin' in the Wind, A Hard Rain Is a Gonna Fall, and Masters of War. These weren't just songs, they were anthems. They captured the anger, hope, and frustration of an entire generation. Blowin' in the Wind became especially famous. The song asked simple but profound questions about freedom, peace, and human rights. Its lyrics resonated with millions of people who were fighting for civil rights and protesting against war. Peter, Paul, and Mary, a popular folk group, recorded their own version of the song, and it became a massive hit, reaching number 2 on the charts. Bob Dylan was suddenly famous. Dylan became the voice of the protest movement. He performed at rallies, marches, and concerts alongside civil rights leaders and other folk singers like Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. In August 1963, he performed Only a Pawn in Their Game at the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. Dylan was only 22 years old, but he was already shaping history. But even as Dylan became the symbol of the protest movement, something inside him was changing. He didn't want to be labeled. He didn't want to be put in a box. He didn't want people telling him what kind of songs he should write. Dylan was an artist, and artists need freedom to explore, experiment, and evolve. And that's exactly what he was about to do, something that would shock his fans and change music forever. Chapter 3: Going Electric and Breaking the Rules. Bob Dylan was at the height of his fame as a folk singer and protest voice when he made a decision that would shock the world and change his career forever. He decided to go electric. This chapter is about how Dylan refused to be defined by anyone's expectations, and how his courage to change made him a true revolutionary in music history. By 1964, Dylan had become the king of folk music. His albums were selling, his concerts were packed, and his songs were being sung at protests and rallies across America. Songs like The Times They Are Changin' became anthems for social change. Dylan was seen as the conscience of his generation, the voice of young people who wanted to make the world better. But Dylan was getting restless. He felt trapped by the folk music scene's expectations. People wanted him to write more protest songs, to be their spokesperson, to stay the same. But Dylan never wanted to stay the same. He was an artist who craved change and experimentation. He wanted to explore new sounds, new styles, new ways of expressing himself.
Dylan had always loved rock and roll. It was his first musical love, after all. He listened to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Animals, and he was fascinated by their energy and electric sound. He started thinking, why couldn't he combine the poetic depth of folk music with the raw power of rock and roll? Why did he have to choose between them? In 1965, Dylan began secretly working on a new album that would blend folk and rock. The album was called Bringing It All Back Home, and half of it featured electric instruments, guitars, keyboards, drums, instead of just acoustic guitar and harmonica. The songs were different too. They were more personal, more surreal, more stream of consciousness. Songs like Subterranean Homesick Blues and Maggie's Farm were fast, electric, and unlike anything Dylan had done before. When Bringing It All Back Home was released in March 1965, it divided his fans. Some loved the new electric sound and saw it as a brilliant evolution. Others felt betrayed. They accused Dylan of selling out, of abandoning the folk music principles that made him famous. They wanted the old Dylan back, the protest singer, the acoustic troubadour. But Dylan didn't care what they wanted. He was following his own artistic vision. The real controversy came a few months later at the Newport Folk Festival in July 1965. The Newport Folk Festival was the most important event in the folk music calendar, a sacred space where traditional acoustic music was celebrated. Dylan had performed there before with just his acoustic guitar, and everyone expected him to do the same this year. But Dylan had other plans. On the evening of July 25, 1965, Bob Dylan walked onto the Newport stage wearing a black leather jacket and carrying an electric guitar. Behind him was a full rock band with electric instruments and a drum kit. The crowd was confused. What was happening? When Dylan and his band launched into Maggie's Farm with a loud electric sound, the crowd erupted, but not with applause. Some people booed, some shouted angrily, some walked out. It was chaos. The folk music purists felt that Dylan had betrayed them, that he had abandoned everything folk music stood for. They saw electric instruments as commercial, as selling out to mainstream pop music. Dylan and his band played only 3 songs before leaving the stage. Some say Dylan was forced off by the angry crowd. Others say he left because he only planned to play 3 songs. The truth remains a mystery. But what's undeniable is that Dylan's performance at Newport 1965 was one of the most controversial moments in music history. After the booing stopped and Dylan left the stage, there was confusion. The festival organizers asked Dylan to return, and he did, but this time with just his acoustic guitar. He performed Mr. Tambourine Man and It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and the crowd calmed down. But the damage was done. Dylan knew that he had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Some people called Dylan a traitor. Folk singer Pete Seeger, one of Dylan's mentors, was reportedly so upset by the electric performance that he wanted to cut the cables with an axe. But Dylan didn't apologize. He later said that he didn't care about being a folk singer or a rock singer. He just wanted to make the music he felt in his heart. Despite the controversy, Dylan kept moving forward. In July 1965, just days after Newport, he released the single Like a Rolling Stone. This song was revolutionary. It was 6 minutes long, far longer than typical radio songs. It had electric guitars, a driving beat, and lyrics that were both poetic and angry. The song asked the question, "How does it feel?" And it felt like Dylan was asking that question to his critics, to society, to everyone. Like a Rolling Stone became a massive hit. It reached number 2 on the Billboard charts and is still considered one of the greatest rock songs ever written.
Dylan had proven that he could succeed on his own terms. He didn't need to follow anyone's rules or meet anyone's expectations. He was free. Dylan followed Like a Rolling Stone with two more groundbreaking albums, Highway 61 Revisited in 1965 and Blonde on Blonde in 1966. These albums featured electric rock music with surreal, poetic lyrics. Songs like The Ballad of a Thin Man, Desolation Row, and Just Like a Woman showed Dylan's incredible range as a songwriter. He was no longer just writing protest songs. He was writing about love, loss, identity, and the absurdity of modern life. But the controversy continued. Fans booed Dylan at concerts around the world. They shouted "Judas" and called him a sellout. At a famous concert in Manchester, England in 1966, someone in the crowd yelled "Judas," and Dylan responded, "I don't believe you, you're a liar." Then he turned to his band and said, "Play it loud," before launching into a thunderous version of Like a Rolling Stone. Dylan's refusal to stay in one place, to be defined by anyone, made him a true artist. He showed the world that real creativity means taking risks, breaking rules, and following your own vision, even when everyone tells you you're wrong. And while some fans never forgave him for going electric, millions more discovered his music and fell in love with his fearless spirit. But Dylan's relentless pace, constant touring, recording, and dealing with controversy was taking a toll. Something was about to happen that would force Dylan to slow down and rethink everything. His life was about to change in an instant. Chapter 4: The Motorcycle Crash and the Mystery Years. Bob Dylan was at the peak of his career, releasing groundbreaking albums and touring constantly, but the pressure was overwhelming. Then, in 1966, something happened that would change his life and add to his mystique forever. This chapter is about the mysterious motorcycle crash, Dylan's retreat from fame, and his remarkable transformation during what fans call the lost years. By mid-1966, Bob Dylan was exhausted. He had been touring non-stop for years, releasing album after album, dealing with constant criticism and controversy over his electric music. He was only 26 years old, but he looked and felt much older. The pressure of being called the voice of a generation was crushing him. He never wanted that title in the first place. Dylan was also dealing with the demands of fame. Everywhere he went, fans and journalists chased him, asking him questions about politics, society, and what his songs meant. Dylan hated being analyzed and interviewed. He felt like people wanted to own him, to tell him what to be. He needed to escape. On July 29, 1966, everything changed. Dylan was riding his Triumph motorcycle on a road near his home in Woodstock, New York, when he crashed. The details of the accident remain mysterious to this day. Some say he broke several vertebrae in his neck. Others say the injuries were minor. Dylan himself has given different versions of the story over the years. What's certain is that the crash gave Dylan the excuse he needed to disappear from public life. Dylan canceled his upcoming tour and stopped performing concerts. He retreated to his home in Woodstock with his wife, Sarah Lowndes, whom he had married in 1965, and their growing family. For someone who had been constantly in the spotlight, this sudden disappearance was shocking. Rumors spread wildly. Some said Dylan was seriously injured. Others said he was suffering from drug addiction. Some even speculated that he had died. But Dylan wasn't dead. He was doing something he hadn't done in years: resting. He spent his days with his family, playing with his children, writing music, and thinking about his life. For the first time since becoming famous, Dylan wasn't performing, wasn't touring, wasn't trying to be Bob Dylan the icon. He was just a man living a quiet life in the countryside. During this period, Dylan started making music again, but in a completely different way. He gathered with a group of musicians called The Band in the basement of a house in Woodstock, and together they recorded hours and hours of music. These recordings, later known as the basement tapes, were never meant to be released to the public. They were just Dylan and his friends experimenting, having fun, and exploring American folk, country, and blues traditions. The songs Dylan wrote during this time were different from his previous work. They were simpler, more rootsy, more connected to traditional American music. Songs like I Shall Be Released, This Wheel's on Fire, and You Ain't Goin' Nowhere showed a softer, more reflective Dylan. He wasn't trying to shock anyone or make a statement, he was just making music for the joy of it. In 1967, while Dylan was living quietly in Woodstock, the world outside was changing rapidly. It was the summer of love, and the counterculture movement was in full swing. Psychedelic rock, hippies, anti-war protests, and experimental music were everywhere. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, pushing rock music into new, colorful, elaborate directions. Everyone expected Dylan to return with something equally revolutionary and psychedelic. But when Dylan finally released his next album in December 1967, it wasn't what anyone expected. The album was called John Wesley Harding, and it was the complete opposite of what was popular at the time. While other artists were making long, elaborate psychedelic albums, Dylan made a short, simple acoustic album with minimal instrumentation. The songs were mysterious, biblical, and cryptic. It was as if Dylan was deliberately going against the trends. Many critics and fans were confused. They expected Dylan to lead the psychedelic revolution, but instead he seemed to be looking backward to older, simpler forms of music. But over time, people realized that Dylan was once again ahead of the curve. He was starting a movement back to roots music, to simplicity and authenticity that would later be called Americana. In 1969, Dylan released another surprising album called Nashville Skyline. This album was pure country music, complete with steel guitars and a smooth, crooning vocal style that was completely different from Dylan's famous nasal voice. The album included a duet with country legend Johnny Cash and the hit song Lay Lady Lay. Dylan was showing the world that he could master any genre he chose. But while these albums were well received, many fans and critics felt that Dylan had lost his edge. They missed the angry, electric Dylan who challenged everything. They missed the protest singer who spoke truth to power. They wondered, had Dylan become too comfortable? Had he given up on changing the world? What they didn't understand was that Dylan had never wanted to be anyone's spokesman. He was an artist, and artists need freedom to explore different styles and ideas. Dylan later said that during this period he was trying to find himself again, to reconnect with the simple pleasures of making music without the pressure of being a revolutionary. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Dylan continued to release albums, but none of them had the impact of his mid-1960s masterpieces. Albums like Self-Portrait in 1970 were critically panned. Some said Dylan had lost his genius, others said he was washed up. Dylan seemed content to live a quiet life away from the spotlight, raising his children and making music on his own terms. But Dylan wasn't finished. In fact, he was just preparing for another remarkable transformation. In 1974, Dylan would return to touring, and in 1975, he would release an album that many consider his last true masterpiece. The Voice of a Generation wasn't done yet. He was just taking a breath before his next reinvention. The motorcycle crash and the years that followed remain one of the most mysterious periods in Dylan's life. Did the crash really happen the way he said? Was it a convenient excuse to escape fame? We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is that this period of rest and reflection changed Dylan. It gave him space to grow, to experiment, and to remember why he loved music in the first place. Chapter 5. Reinvention, Redemption, and Legacy. Bob Dylan's career spans more than 60 decades, and throughout that time he has never stopped changing, challenging expectations, and creating music. This final chapter explores Dylan's remarkable journey through the 1970s and beyond, his struggles and comebacks, and why he remains one of the most important artists in history. In 1974, after years of living quietly, Bob Dylan returned to the public eye with a major tour. He reunited with the band, the group of musicians he had worked with during his electric tours in the 1960s. The tour was massive. Dylan played to sold-out arenas across America. Fans were thrilled to see him back on stage. Dylan was still young, only 33 years old, and it seemed like he was ready to reclaim his throne as the king of rock and roll. But Dylan wasn't interested in nostalgia. In 1975, he released Blood on the Tracks, an album that stunned critics and fans alike. The album was deeply personal, filled with songs about love, loss, heartbreak, and betrayal. Many people believed the songs were about Dylan's troubled marriage to Sarah, which was falling apart. Songs like Tangled Up in Blue, Simple Twist of Fate, and Idiot Wind were raw, emotional, and brilliant. Blood on the Tracks is now considered one of Dylan's greatest albums, proof that his genius had never left him. Following Blood on the Tracks, Dylan embarked on a unique tour called the Rolling Thunder Revue in 1975 to 1976. This wasn't a typical arena tour. Instead, Dylan put together a traveling caravan of musicians, poets, and artists, playing in small theaters and unusual venues. Dylan wore white face paint and a wide-brimmed hat, creating a mysterious, almost carnival-like atmosphere. The tour featured guest appearances by Joan Baez, Allen Ginsberg, and other counterculture icons. It was spontaneous, chaotic, and magical, pure Dylan. But the late 1970s brought new challenges. Dylan's marriage to Sarah ended in divorce in 1977, which was emotionally devastating. His albums during this period received mixed reviews. Some critics said Dylan was no longer relevant, that his best years were behind him. Dylan was entering middle age, and the music industry was changing. Punk rock and disco were the new sounds, and folk rock seemed outdated. Then, in 1979, Dylan shocked everyone again, this time by announcing that he had become a born-again Christian. He released 3 albums of Christian music: Slow Train Coming, Saved, and Shot of Love. Dylan's conversion was genuine and deeply felt, but many of his longtime fans were confused and disappointed. They had admired Dylan for questioning authority and religion, and now he was preaching from the stage. During concerts, Dylan would sometimes lecture audiences about faith and salvation, which alienated some fans. But even during his Christian period, Dylan's songwriting remained powerful. Slow Train Coming included songs like Gotta Serve Somebody, which won Dylan his first Grammy Award. The song's message was simple but profound. Everyone serves someone or something, whether it's God, money, or the devil. Dylan's Christian period eventually faded, but it showed once again his willingness to follow his own path, regardless of what others thought. The 1980s were a difficult decade for Dylan. His albums during this period were inconsistent, and critics were harsh. Some called him a has-been, a relic from a bygone era. Dylan struggled to find his voice in a music landscape dominated by MTV, synthesizers, and pop stars like Michael Jackson and Madonna. He seemed lost, uncertain, and uninspired. But Dylan never gave up. In 1988, he began what he called the Never-Ending Tour, a commitment to tour constantly, playing concerts almost every year for the rest of his life. The Never-Ending Tour became Dylan's way of staying connected to his music and his fans. He played small venues and large festivals, constantly changing his set lists and rearranging his old songs in new ways. For Dylan, performing live was a way to keep his music alive and evolving. In 1997, Dylan released Time Out of Mind, an album that marked a stunning comeback. The album was dark, moody, and reflective, dealing with themes of death, aging, and mortality. Critics hailed it as a return to form, and it won Dylan 3 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. At 56 years old, Dylan proved he could still create relevant, powerful music. Songs like Lovesick and Not Dark Yet showed that Dylan's poetic gift had not diminished with age. The 2000s brought even more recognition and respect for Dylan's legacy. In 2001, he released Love and Theft, another critically acclaimed album. He continued touring relentlessly, and his concerts became legendary, though unpredictable. Dylan would change lyrics, melodies, and arrangements every night, making each performance unique. Fans never knew exactly what they would get, which was part of the magic. In 2006, Dylan released Modern Times, an album that debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts, his first #1 album in 30 years. At 66 years old, Dylan was still making music that mattered. He won more Grammy Awards and received increasing recognition as one of the greatest artists of all time. Then came one of the greatest honors of Dylan's career. In 2016, Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, the first musician ever to receive this prestigious award. The Nobel Committee recognized Dylan for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. It was a controversial choice. Some people argued that song lyrics aren't literature, but most people agreed that Dylan's words had shaped culture, inspired millions, and elevated popular music to an art form. Dylan didn't attend the Nobel Prize ceremony in person, sending rock star Patti Smith to perform A Hard Rain Is a Gonna Fall on his behalf. When he finally accepted the prize months later, Dylan delivered a humble speech acknowledging the great literary works that had influenced him, from Homer to Shakespeare to Moby Dick. He understood that he stood on the shoulders of giants. Throughout his career, Bob Dylan has released over 39 studio albums, countless live recordings, and written hundreds of songs. His influence on music is immeasurable. He changed what popular music could be, showing that songs could be poetic, complex, and meaningful. He inspired countless artists, from the Beatles to Bruce Springsteen to countless others. But Dylan's greatest achievement isn't just his music, it's his refusal to be defined or limited. He has constantly reinvented himself, challenged expectations, and followed his own artistic vision. He went from folk to rock to country to gospel to blues, never staying in one place for long. He has been criticized, booed, and dismissed, but he has never stopped creating. Bob Dylan's story teaches us that true artistry requires courage. It requires the willingness to take risks, to be misunderstood, to be criticized. It requires following your own path even when everyone is telling you to stay where you are. Dylan showed us that we don't have to be what others expect us to be. We can constantly grow, change, and evolve. Today, Bob Dylan is in his 80s and still performing. The never-ending tour continues. He's still writing, still creating, still exploring. His voice may be more weathered now, but his spirit remains unbroken. He's a reminder that creativity has no expiration date, that artists never retire, they just keep going. So, my friends, let Bob Dylan's story inspire you to be fearless in your own life. Don't let anyone put you in a box. Don't be afraid to change, to grow, to become someone new. If people boo you for following your dreams, let them boo, and then play it loud. Be like Bob Dylan, mysterious, rebellious, and always moving forward. What did you think of this incredible journey? Isn't Bob Dylan's story one of the most inspiring stories in music history? Let his life remind you that no matter what anyone says, you have the power to reinvent yourself again and again. Never stop creating, never stop evolving, never be true to yourself. Be like Dylan, unpredictable, uncompromising, and unforgettable.